To escape bullying, he locked himself away for 5 years in despair. Afterward, with no hope for the future, he continued living a dull life until death unexpectedly arrived. In the afterlife, Hart was fortunate enough to meet a goddess who granted him another life through reincarnation. In the world he was about to enter, magic was considered absolute power, and the goddess, taking pity on him, cheated to give Hart a less difficult life. Hart's life began anew in the body of a baby, accompanied by the cheers of the king. The king thanked Gislot for giving birth to a beautiful prince who resembled him and her, with a royal emblem on the baby's chest. Hart wondered if the handsome man and beautiful woman beside him were his parents. He began imagining the wonderful scenes of his new life. The king ordered his attendant to bring a sphere to check the child's magical power. When they discovered that Hart had a magic index of only 2, with no usable attributes except barrier magic, the couple was shocked. The king said if news spread that a child born to him and Gislot lacked ability, there would surely be trouble. Gislot, also panicking, insisted this information must never leave the room. Hart, lying in his crib, sensed an ominous premonition. Subsequently, both parents unanimously announced that Prince Hart, born that day, had died. Hart was then taken to the forest and abandoned. The goddess, learning this chaotic news, didn't know what to do. The child she had cheated for had fallen into a miserable life right after birth. Perhaps because the world's magic measuring device could only display 2 digits, but the number she had set was 4 digits, 1002. In the forest, Hart faced a predicament. In an infant's body, he could do nothing. Thinking about using magic as others had mentioned, Hart first created a floating cube-shaped barrier. He could make it larger and color it. He could do anything he could imagine. Hart's movements attracted a fox that wanted to eat him. Hart used his magical powers to avoid the fox's bite, and could even use magic to move branches and rocks to crush the magical beast. Strangely, Hart could understand the fox as it begged for mercy and surrendered. She sat down beside him, saying she had intended to eat him to supplement her magical power, but didn't expect him to be so strong. Hart used a sound barrier to converse with the girl. When asked about his identity, he casually replied he was just a child abandoned due to having too little power. The girl saw streams of magic flowing gracefully from Hart and whispered in disbelief. After reconsidering, she shouted if he was the reincarnation of a demon lord. Then she rolled onto the ground, saying she surrendered and asked him to kill her. Hart, uninterested, replied that as long as she didn't randomly attack others in the future, it was fine. Flay smiled and praised Hart for his generosity, truly befitting a demon lord. In an infant's body, Hart lacked the stamina to argue with her, and having used considerable strength dealing with Flay, he was about to faint from hunger. At that moment, a man arrived with a bag of milk, but Flay blocked him, not allowing him near her master. Gold explained that the child was a distant relative of his, and though he didn't know why the baby was abandoned, he had come to save him. Hart whispered for Flay to accept it quickly as he was about to starve. She remained skeptical, asking why Gold would care so much about someone else's child that he'd bring milk deep into the forest at night. Gold painfully replied that his wife had once given birth to a child, but sadly, the baby couldn't cry at birth. Hart was abandoned because he lacked power, but for a baron like Gold, this didn't matter. No matter the child's condition, he hoped the boy could enjoy life. Seeing Flay cry at his story, Gold had never seen such a strange magical creature, one that not only cried, but accepted a human boy as her master. He suggested that if she had accepted the boy as her master, he would also take her in as a servant. Moved by Gold's compassion, Flay decided to follow and care for Hart. The agreement between the two was established. Gold carefully smashed Hart's cradle, tore his clothes, and finally poured some fresh blood over them. 9 years passed with Hart being raised by Baron Gold's family at the frontier. He had planned to leave after weaning, but unconsciously stayed due to the gentleness of his adoptive parents. Hart had a younger sister named Char, who always feared approaching him. However, Char liked to follow Flay and wanted her to play together. Flay coldly refused, saying her important duty was caring for Hart. Unexpectedly, Hart interrupted the two, asking Flay to look after his sister. Thus, he stood watching them play happily from above, his solitary figure looking somewhat gloomy. Natalia approached, telling Hart not to worry. As a mother, she guessed Char simply didn't know how to interact with someone close to her age. Hart completely collapsed upon hearing this, falling into panic and wondering if the little girl had seen through his true age. Natalia comforted Hart, telling him not to be discouraged and that he could find a gift for the little girl. Moreover, it wasn't good for him, as the future heir of the land, to keep shutting himself in his room. Hart returned to his room, still thinking about his plan to leave the family. For 9 years, in preparation for his departure, Hart had dedicated himself to researching barrier magic. He had successfully created a barrier robot with an appearance identical to himself, though it couldn't yet speak or move. Gold came to Hart's room, calling him outside to train and asking what he did locked up in his room all day. Hart thought for a moment, then replied that he was obviously isolating himself to research ancient magic. Gold was pleased with his son's answer and tossed him a sword to test his abilities. Surprisingly, Hart could break the sword in Gold's hand, who then announced he would attack with another strike. Just as the sword was about to touch Hart, he instinctively jumped to avoid it. Gold stood stunned, looking at his son. The force required to avoid what just happened would need to be above level 30. Actually, regarding this issue, he still felt something was strange. Gold whispered that it might be an awakening in the unconscious. In the evening, when he met his wife, Gold told her that according to his conjecture, Hart could very well be a reincarnated magical being. Natalia disagreed because Hart had no tail or long ears. Gold remembered the royal emblem on his chest. But with a magical beast like Flay following him, he must certainly be no ordinary person. Natalia rejected all her husband's suspicions, asserting Hart was a normal child, nothing more. Little Char, lying on her mother's lap, slowly opened her eyes with a determined gaze, absolutely believing her brother was not a magical being. After training with his father for a short time, Hart noticed his father's frequent absence from home. Curious about what was keeping his father busy, he activated a surveillance barrier and saw many wounded soldiers beside Gold. He followed the address to ask him what had happened. Gold sadly informed his son that the territory was being ravaged by bandits, but their location was unknown, making it difficult to resolve the situation cleanly. This was extremely dangerous for a child like Hart. So after explaining clearly, Gold told him to return home quickly. Hart obeyed his father and headed back. But as he passed the wounded soldiers lying on the ground, he quietly used healing magic on them. That night, he and Flay planned to help his father clean up this trouble. The first step was to locate the bandits who had attacked the soldiers through the surveillance system. Their findings exceeded expectations. Among the bandits appeared a soldier under Gold's command. Flay guessed the enemy had an insider with the Baron's information, a threat that needed immediate elimination. Hart and Flay flew from home on a moonlit night, a scene accidentally witnessed by his sister Char. At the bandits' base, having received news of today's big victory, they were celebrating heartily. The leader ordered them to complete their mission soon so they could return to the Empire. Hart and Flay suddenly appeared. He used magic to immobilize them and softly asked who they were. Seeing they wouldn't cooperate, Hart grabbed the first one and threw him against the wall, warning that their only job was to answer his questions. Upon receiving answers, Hart pieced together the entire situation. Only someone in a higher position than his father could do this. There was only one possibility: someone in the kingdom was targeting Gold's life. Before leaving, Hart ordered Flay to burn the entire fortress. Those who attacked his father deserved no mercy. On the way back, Hart told Flay that whether they were Imperial people or someone else, he would show no mercy to those who touched the people close to him. For now, he would send an anonymous letter to his father about today's events. The next morning, Gold received the news and sighed, saying he had sensed the bandits were unusual, but hadn't considered the Empire might be involved. Char, sitting in her father's lap, asked who had killed the bad guys. Gold replied that he was also wondering if it was someone with power and familiar with the territory. It could only be Flay. She often roamed the territory subjugating magical beasts, so perhaps she had taken care of this as well. Char seemed to realize something and quickly jumped down, asking permission to leave. As she had thought of another possibility, she couldn't tell her father. The little girl found Flay and asked if her brother had two personas. She recounted seeing her brother and Flay flying from the house, so she went to his room to check, and her brother was still sleeping in bed, but without the frightening aura she usually saw. Flay didn't answer the girl, diverting the conversation by praising her for being able to see the magical power around Hart. She told the little girl that he had been born with immeasurable power, which was something truly wonderful. Char asked another question. Did Flay know her brother's identity? Flay continued to withhold information, making up that it was a secret that children couldn't know. Hart, hearing her recount everything, thought he needed to be more careful with his actions. He spared no effort installing many alert devices in case Char came near. For the next several days, the little girl followed Hart everywhere, whether he was bathing, reading, or training with his father. Hart wanted to stop and ask what was going on, but each time he approached, she ran away. It wasn't until the 7th day, when the girl and her mother prepared for an outing, that she stopped following Hart. Concerned for their safety, Hart wanted to send Flay with them. Natalia replied she hadn't seen her recently, asking if Hart had asked her to do something. Only then did he remember he'd asked Flay to scare away magical beasts from attacking the town. After his mother and sister departed, Hart returned to his room and began observing them through the surveillance system on Char. As soon as he opened it, Hart's mouth trembled as he shouted, "Don't joke around!" The barrier showed another group of bandits appearing, intending to kill his mother and sister. Natalia held her daughter as they fled, wondering why Imperial soldiers were here. A new barrier was placed on Char by Hart, and the girl pointed her mother in the designated direction. Natalia realized someone was secretly directing her daughter's path, though she didn't know how, but now wasn't the time to think about this. The two ran to a deep ravine, and Char pointed down for her mother to jump. Halfway down, the protective magic on Natalia was depleted, causing mother and daughter to fall. Upon hitting the ground, she knew her magic was nearly exhausted and couldn't run any further. Char pointed to a rock ahead, exclaiming, "Mom, just a little more." She carried the child inside, where there was a cave with abnormally growing luminescent moss. She observed the surroundings, thinking such a bright place couldn't provide hiding. Natalia carried Char to a hidden corner, lying that she would go outside to find the person guiding the girl, not knowing who it was but certain they were an ally of justice. Char begged her mother not to go, crying loudly. Despite her heartbreak, Natalia still ran outside the cave, believing this was the only way to protect her daughter. As soon as she ran out, the cave behind her disappeared, returning to the form of a rock. Natalia whispered, "Illusion magic, who could do this?" At that moment, the Imperial group arrived with swords. The leader, seeing only Natalia, shouted for those behind to find the child who must be nearby. Natalia knew she couldn't become a prisoner and drew her sword, preparing to act. The leader watched her intently, fearing resistance, but before he could threaten her, her sword turned toward her own neck. Hart didn't arrive in time and held Natalia tightly in his arms, looking furiously at the group. Inside the cave, Char anxiously called for her mother repeatedly, but feared being discovered by the group and dared not raise her voice. Hart carried Natalia in from outside, informing the little girl her mother was fine. He instructed that since her mother had fainted, the girl should stay by her side. Just bear with it a little longer, and help would come. Char, hiding behind a rock, sensed the familiar frightening aura, but her brother had saved her and her mother. So the little girl gathered all her courage, stood up, and called out to her brother loudly. Recalling her mother's words, she asked if her brother was an ally of justice. Hart, unsure how to present himself, was momentarily stunned by his little sister's question. Finally, he decided to go along with his sister for now. Hart laughed loudly and replied, "That's right, I am an ally of justice." The little girl asked if her brother's power was used to eliminate evildoers. She still remembered her mother's words that allies of justice punish evil. Char stood next to Hart, looking up at him exclaiming, "Oh my, and I've always misunderstood my brother." Hart smiled, comforting his sister that because of his secret identity, he couldn't tell others. Hart quickly returned home to Gold's side, who asked his son what he thought of the person who had helped his sister and mother. Without thinking, he replied that if that person wasn't doing bad things, then they weren't an enemy. Gold nodded. "Right, my daughter also said they were an ally of justice." Hart casually brought up a question, asking his father why, despite increased border patrols, they still managed to get in. Gold quickly jumped to the conclusion that someone had infiltrated the territory before he increased security. Hart replied that was close, but there was something else more accurate: allies. Gold assessed his son, not thinking a 9-year-old could say such things. He returned to anger, silently cursing that old fox who couldn't wait any longer. Char and her mother returned, interrupting the conversation between the two. After hugging her father, the little girl ran straight to her brother. Father and mother were surprised by the girl's action, wondering when the siblings had become so close. Char honestly replied that when appropriate, she could be a very good child. Hart inwardly pleaded for his sister to drop that suggestive way of speaking. Since the day she discovered Hart's identity, there wasn't a day when Char didn't come to her brother's room to play. The days of being disliked were gone, but now that he was being followed around, he truly didn't know what to do. Hart patted his sister's head without feeling annoyed. On the contrary, it felt like having a pet companion. The little girl noticed the glowing screen on the desk and curiously asked her brother what it was. Hart explained it was a surveillance barrier, and when she asked if it was ancient magic, he simply went along with her and confirmed it. Hart had once casually told his father that he was researching ancient magic. Hearing his sister praise how amazing he was, Hart replied that because these were magic techniques that had lost their documentation with nothing left, the research was somewhat difficult. Char, led on by her brother, revealed that she had seen books about ancient magic in the castle library. As promised, Char took Hart to where the books on ancient magic were kept. Looking through the books, he noticed that barrier magic had many similarities with ancient magic. The little girl sat beside her brother, looking at the book he was holding, and said ancient magic had many interpretations, but this one was the most interesting. Hart was surprised and asked if she had read it. Chart excitedly replied that she was taught by her mother and Flay, so she also wanted her brother to read it. Seeing his sister's expectant look, Hart had no way to refuse, and he began to activate his big brother skills. While chatting with his sister, Hart accidentally mentioned an anime character he had read about in his previous life. The little girl looked at him with sparkling eyes, wanting to see it. Hart indulged her request, and 2 weeks later, he had basically designed a system that could access the modern Japanese internet. The accounts he had previously registered were still running smoothly. For now, Hart chose children's content for his sister to watch. Char was amazed looking at the moving images with sound. But then another problem arose. She said she couldn't understand what they were saying and asked her brother to teach her Japanese. Initially, Hart was worried that his sister, being only 5 years old, would have difficulty learning a new language. After just 2 hours, he abandoned this thought. She had already mastered hiragana and katakana. Seeing Char type elementary school children's language into the search bar, Hart was astonished, wondering what was with the children of this world. 2 weeks later, Char rushed in from outside, urgently asking her brother to play the next episode of Tamism for her. After the TV was turned on, she sat obediently on the chair, attentively watching the screen. Hart thought it had been 2 weeks since Char started watching anime, and she had learned Japanese from the shows almost fluently. He wondered if his sister might be a genius girl. If that were true, he couldn't let her watch anime all the time. Hart began an internal struggle. Seeing how happy she looked, he couldn't bear to forbid it. But as a brother, he couldn't spoil his sister. When Char made a request to watch a new episode, he refused for the first time and set a rule that she could only watch 3 hours a day. Char became dejected, and throughout dinner, her mind was foggy. Natalia, sitting beside her, asked if her daughter was sleepy. Gold asked his son why his sister had been following him lately and what they were planning. Char woke from her daze and quickly replied that they were researching ancient magic. Natalia happily asked if Hart was teaching his sister, saying that was very good, and she added that Hart shouldn't let his sister get too obsessed. After dinner, Char still followed behind her brother. Hart stopped to let her know that no matter how much she begged, he wouldn't let her watch anymore. He told his sister to quickly prepare for a bath and then go to bed. Natalia, who had been sneaking behind them, didn't expect the siblings to be so close. She smiled, thinking her dream was about to come true. Gold, with his title of Baron, had a duty to suppress the bandits and couldn't let them continue causing havoc in his territory. All 3 family members saw him off. Char whispered a prayer for her father's safe return. Seeing his sister still dejected, Hart comforted her not to worry. Though called bandits, they were just ordinary people, and he was sure their father could handle it alone. Char wondered and asked her brother why they wanted to become bandits. The little girl sadly recounted that her father had said there was recently civil unrest in the empire. Couldn't people live happily with each other? Hearing her say this, even Hart felt that such a wish was too difficult. Char thought of something and asked if her brother was the same. If her brother went to battle, he couldn't do anything either, right? She stood up from her chair excitedly, explaining that her brother's power could be used for this purpose. Char looked at her brother with sparkling eyes again, asking what he thought. Looking into those eyes, Hart softened and replied that he understood. As soon as she received confirmation, the little girl urged her brother to transform and go into battle, just like the hero characters. Hart, indulging his sister to the fullest, transformed into a caped warrior of adult size who could instantly teleport to the battlefield. He even opened a barrier screen for her to watch the battle directly. Hart, flying in the sky, thought this had become super complicated, but for Char, he had to try his best. As soon as he found the bandits, Hart first blocked their escape route. Next, he could directly kill them. But because Char wanted to see him perform, he had to go down and fight them one by one. Because he had to fight each person individually, it took quite a bit of time. When Hart finished, Gold arrived just in time. He assessed that the situation wasn't about creating internal division. He introduced himself to Hart and then asked for information about him in return. Hart breathed a sigh of relief that Gold didn't recognize him in his disguise. Gold continued asking if he was the one who had saved his wife and child earlier, saying that at the very least, he should know what his real purpose was. Hart's mind suddenly lit up, and he danced in front of Gold, telling him he was a person of justice, promoting justice and enforcing justice. After saying this, he became embarrassed by his own corny words and flew up into the sky, disappearing. Back beside his beloved bed, he collapsed in exhaustion. Char, chasing behind, excitedly praised her brother for being super skilled. Hearing no response, the little girl still didn't give up and eagerly asked when he would transform again. And so, Hart went through countless battles with his identity as the Dark Warrior, becoming known to more and more people, his fame spreading far. Parallel to this, Hart had also completed the robot version of himself, creating a fully human-like Hart C. One morning, Char woke up to see 2 brothers who could both speak, unable to distinguish which was her real brother. The real Hart grumbled that neither belonged to her. That same morning, the princess and prince came to visit Baron Gold's house. Prince Laius waved his arm in front of his face, annoyed, asking why it was so dusty, truly a countryside. Princess Marian reminded her brother that he was being too disrespectful. He was the one who had insisted on coming here. Hart looked at the 2 of them, thinking he had once heard that he was the king's child. So the 2 people standing before him must be his siblings. Meanwhile, the 2 siblings on the other side were still arguing. Laius stated that his sister was just a political pawn and had no right to teach him. Laius looked over everyone present, scolding them all as people who didn't know etiquette. He stared at Hart like a research subject, asking, "Isn't this the level 2 cast-off that the Baron adopted from an orphanage?" Laius chose him as the first person he would teach a lesson. On the training ground, he looked at Hart, telling him to relax, that he would go easy on him. Hart activated his magic assessment, learning that this guy's current level was 9 and his maximum would be 40. While he was still thinking, Laius suddenly attacked. Hart instinctively dodged, and Laius shouted for him not to avoid. Hart obediently activated protection, then fell to the ground, pretending to be in pain, letting Laius hit him. Laius was initially happy, but later felt bored, asking why Hart didn't fight back. Hearing the words, "fight back," Hart suddenly stood up. He took just a few sword strikes to make the prince flat on the ground. Princess Marion was shocked, asking if Gold's son was really level 2. Gold casually replied that he didn't know, and neither did the boy. So in the end, it was assumed to be so. Laius advanced again, intending to intimidate Hart with magic, but all his magical power was caught by Hart and amplified at once, causing him to fearfully kneel on the ground. Hart felt the match should end there. He needed to return to his room to sleep. Flay, having heard that Hart had recently been completing missions alone, quickly appeared, wanting to join the two siblings in their tasks. Contrary to Char's happy expression, Hart inwardly groaned that trouble had come again. He couldn't stop Flay, so he could only instruct her not to make excessive fighting movements in front of his sister. Flay quickly replied that she understood and promised absolutely not to do that. The promise was barely made when, seconds later, she directly used fire, wanting to burn the bandits to ashes. Hart stopped her, asking her to wait a bit, and asked if she remembered what she had just promised. Flay, too excited, didn't hear what he said and continued throwing one flame after another. Hart couldn't bear to watch anymore and directly used his magic to create a barrier protecting the bandits' lives. The battle became chaotic because of Flay, and by the time they returned home, Hart had no strength left to open his eyes. Flay's voice echoed in the room, recounting the recent process to Chart, who added a few admiring comments. Hart inwardly cried out, wondering when he would ever have a peaceful life. In contrast to the lively atmosphere, Laius's room was filled with a gloomy air. He punched his bed hard, asking himself why he had to face something like this. He was the prince, the successor to the king, and the one to continue the bloodline of Princess Lightning. He couldn't swallow his anger at being defeated by a commoner with only level 2. A servant outside knocked on the door, entering to inform him about tomorrow's inspection tour and to invite Char to join. Laius, confused, asked why they needed to invite a little girl along. The servant replied that the prince would need someone to talk to along the way. Seeing that he was still about to refuse, the servant meaningfully emphasized that this was also part of evaluating the prince. That night, Hart heard the news that his sister would be joining the tour, so he needed to prepare everything perfectly. He surveyed the entire route they would travel through his surveillance barrier. On the screen suddenly appeared a mysterious group performing a strange ritual. Hart could tell something was about to happen. Hart approached, asking what they were doing. When they learned he was from Baron Gold's household, they decided to kill him without mercy. If things were this way, he also didn't need to show them any leniency. To counter Hart, they used magic from within their circle to summon a group of zombies. If this were in a game, he would find it cool, but in real life, it was somewhat frightening. He used his sword to cut through once, and although their bodies were split in two, they quickly revived. The zombies surrounded Hart, closing in. He set up a barrier to keep them away and took this opportunity to find the glowing points on their chests. Seeing they no longer moved, the mysterious people shouted, ordering them to attack. But surprisingly, all the zombies turned back and attacked them instead. Backed into a corner, one person from within the circle summoned a golem toward Hart. He was alarmed, not expecting to encounter a golem. Its power was no small matter. One of its punches broke the barrier Hart had previously established. He admitted he had been overconfident in his defense's durability. Not knowing how to attack it, Hart noticed a glowing point on the golem's chest, similar to the center of the zombie's chests. He avoided the opponent's attack and then used a sharp object to pierce the glowing point. The stone was destroyed, and the golem fell under Hart's control through spell appropriation. For the remaining humans, Hart only asked which one was the leader. He wanted to know his name and affiliation. The leader was pointed out, but he wouldn't answer any of Hart's questions. Left with no choice, Hart threw each of the leader's subordinates into a deep pit to threaten him. Each person thrown down continuously shouted, calling for their captain. Unable to watch anymore, the leader reluctantly revealed they were a group of summoners under the queen. From his confession, Hart also learned that this entire plan was meant to take Char's life. He reflected that Char was a person of excellent quality who would sooner or later surpass the queen. Moreover, if the border baron had backing, the country's future would be decentralized. Hart connected the recent events. First, the manipulation of imperial troops to attack his father. Then the attack on his mother and Char very likely. It was all orchestrated by the queen. If she could abandon him, then for her position, there was nothing she wouldn't dare to do. Hart remembered the image of his current 4-person family. He would never forgive anyone who took away the important people in his life. Thanks to Hart clearing all dangers the night before, everyone's tour proceeded according to plan with no incidents. In a golden wheat field, Char ran ahead happily, calling for Marion to follow her. Laius, not wanting to stay with Hart, glanced at him once, then also chased after the other two. Taking the opportunity to be alone, Hart sought out his father, having important questions for him. Hart casually asked what to do if the queen was targeting Char's life. Contrary to his son's nervousness, Gold propped his chin on his hand and whispered that it seemed his son had sensed something too. Last night, he had received a letter from the Dark Knight. He suspected the person behind everything was the queen, but was surprised she was targeting Char. He helplessly told Hart that clearly, she wanted to crush their family. She was the queen on high, and they could do nothing. He thought of something, then patted his son's head, instructing him not to do anything foolish. If the country lacked her, it would suffer greatly. The most tragic thing was that the authority of His Majesty King Jilk had collapsed long ago. Hart summarized his father's words. If the queen died, civil war would erupt. Gold, for the first time, told him about how the army established by Giselot had single-handedly taken the head of the Demon Lord. After that event, she became a hero and began to be called Princess Lightning. Thus, with the strong support of the people, Giselot married the king and became even more beloved. The noteworthy thing now was that Princess Lightning wanted to seize the kingdom. Hart, not wanting any connection to his birth parents, had not investigated anything for all these years, and he felt this was an oversight. Gold, sitting beside him, again offered his perspective. If someone strong could replace the queen, it would be a different story. He had seen that person, but they were still too young. At least, he would wait until that person grew up. He emphasized that a good child would become an outstanding person who would shake the kingdom. Hart listened attentively to his father's words, firmly believing in his mind that the person was Char, not knowing that Gold's eyes had always been assessing him. Gold thought he understood what he was implying, so he concluded with a sentence saying he knew what his son should do next to not disappoint this father's expectations. Hart confirmed he understood, planning in his mind to protect Char until she became an excellent queen. News spread that Giselot's group of summoners had been completely eliminated by a knight from the borderlands, and the plan to assassinate Char had failed. The consecutive failures of her plans made her extremely angry. Although she didn't want to admit it, the child Char had become a threat to her. Giselot selected a weapon from the room, preparing to take matters into her own hands with the sword that had defeated the Demon Lord. Hart's voice rang out, telling her to duel with him first. The soldiers beside Princess Lightning were killed by magic in an instant. She looked at the Dark Knight, asking why he was able to sneak in without being stopped by her barrier. Hart casually asked if she was referring to the miscellaneous things outside, saying he just broke through them easily. Giselot guessed that the person before her must be the Dark Knight from the rumors. She immediately opened 3 magic circles, intending to take his life. Hart easily escaped from the magic zone, then avoided countless glowing fragments flying toward him. Realizing that her 2 spells couldn't harm Hart, she switched to fire, wanting to burn him to ashes. Seeing Hart slowly descending to the ground, Giselot mocked him, saying what kind of Dark Knight was he, just a mediocre thing after all. Hart expressed admiration that she could not only use swords but also had other attributes, saying he was truly envious. The Dark Knight suddenly counterattacked, causing all the aura that Princess Lightning sensed to disappear. Hart whispered that he would get a little serious now. The large amount of magical power flowing in made Princess Lightning unable to resist. Even the Demon Lord she had once fought didn't have such an enormous amount of magic. She didn't surrender. She still had the sword in her hand that she could use. The sword had a certain power that made her confident she was the strongest in the world. But once again, Hart confounded her by knocking the sword out of her hand. Hart didn't want to argue with this old woman anymore. He directly placed a chain around her neck, warning that if she tried to remove it, she would certainly lose her head. Princess Lightning cursed him as a bastard, asking what he wanted by humiliating her to this extent. Hart coldly told her that he didn't care about her upcoming plans. If she continued to harm Baron Gold's household and his family's territory, she wouldn't be safe. Except for him, no one else could remove the collar from her neck. Giselot was so angry she laughed, saying this was no different from slavery. Flay remarked that Hart had been somewhat lenient with her. It had been a long time since she had seen something so beautiful yet incomplete. Hart replied that he thought this was fine. For now, there would be peace. However, if she did anything more, there would be no mercy next time. 5 years passed, and Char faced no more dangers. The territory returned to peace. Hart's display of power that year in front of Princess Lightning had been the right move. Although he had been in this place for almost 15 years, the northern snow still made Hart uncomfortable. Looking back at Flay, still in her usual attire, he asked if she didn't feel cold. Flay honestly admitted that of course she was cold. The human form was troublesome. Hart couldn't stand it anymore and used magic to wrap an extra fur coat around her, telling her to speak up next time if she needed anything. Flay's eyes lit up as she replied that she had 10 more requests, which earned her a glare from Hart. Char softly asked her brother if she could make a request too. She had just thought of a snow-based killing technique, but the next part she only whispered for Hart to hear. As a brother who doted on his sister, he had never refused any request from her. This time, despite his bad premonition, Hart still fulfilled what the little girl wanted, creating a deep hole that wouldn't be filled with snow. Just then, Gold and Natalia happened to see them. He asked what they were doing. Char whispered worriedly to her brother that they would be exposed. Hart quickly created a dark knight who danced and then disappeared, telling his parents it was that person's doing. To be more convincing, Hart added that he had passed by and was showing them his special technique. Gold, half closing his eyes, let it go, saying they would accept that explanation. Regarding Princess Lightning, he still didn't know what had happened that year, only that she no longer appeared in public. People passed around rumors that she suddenly wore a collar like a slave. At first, they thought it was a new fashion trend, but as time went on, they came to a different conclusion, that she had mistakenly put it on and couldn't take it off. Hart thought that from here on, his life of dependence would officially begin, without having to worry about anything else. By a son's intuition, Hart felt something wasn't right, so he stepped away from Gold at a distance. Gold noticed his action and directly announced that in spring, he would enter the Royal Capital School. Hart's ideal life, which had just appeared before his eyes, immediately vanished. Back home, Gold sat down seriously to talk with his son. Once before, Gold had intended to send his son to study at the Territories School, but Hart had strongly objected. He rubbed his forehead, telling his son that this time he couldn't refuse just because he didn't like it. Gold showed Hart the recommendation letter. The king had directly named him to go. According to Gold's thoughts, it was possibly because Princess Marion was interested in Hart's magical talent and had asked the king to issue the order. Hart still didn't understand why his sister would want him to attend a magic school. Gold informed his son of another piece of news. Prince Laius had skipped grades and would be enrolling with Hart, hoping both would study and research together to develop the kingdom. Hart was discouraged. This was truly a difficult matter. He had already prepared himself to live a leisurely, dependent life for the rest of his days. Seeing his son say nothing, Gold expressed his concern to Hart, saying he wasn't sure if Giselot had instigated the princess to approach his son. However, as a father, he hoped Hart would have a broader world. It was good that his son locked himself in his room to research, but beyond that, he wanted Hart to see more of the outside world. Hart completely respected his father and agreed to go to school. The first thing Hart needed to do was choose a servant to help him focus on his studies. He refused his father's kind offer to select a servant for him and also declined his mother's wish to follow and take care of him. Seeing his son having difficulty making a choice, Gold told Hart to take his time. As they still had 3 months, Hart returned to his room and began planning for his duplicate to attend school. If the copy performed poorly, he wouldn't be accepted, and Hart wouldn't have to go. The only way was to be so poor academically that he would be expelled. That was the best way for Hart to avoid causing trouble for his father. Hart's clone didn't agree to go, asking what if some madman used magic recklessly and killed him. Hart came up with a way to protect him with a barrier to prevent injury, which made Hart see a bit calmer. He sighed, saying that no matter how perfect he was still just a copy of Hart. He also had the ideal of wanting to live a dependent life. There was no way around it. He had to compromise on going to school. The most difficult thing for Hart now was to find a suitable servant, while also keeping this a secret from Flay and Char. While wandering aimlessly, he stumbled into a different space filled with a large number of zombies. Remembering that he had asked Flay to arrange them, he didn't expect it to have now become a developed village. Johnny, the village chief, a zombie, was extremely happy to welcome Hart when he saw him arrive. He quickly called Hart, "Your Majesty," thanking him for traveling thousands of miles to visit. Johnny stood ready to receive orders. Hart had no tasks for them. He noticed there were other magical beasts and asked why they were there. Johnny reported that they were wild magical beasts that Flay had gathered and brought to the village. Hart stood observing their activities for a while. Everything was clearly arranged in order, each person doing a different job. Johnny suggested asking Hart if he wanted to look around, then personally led him throughout the village. First, they looked at well-cared-for crops. Thanks to these plants, the villagers would no longer live in worry. He continued to lead Hart through several other areas, taking the opportunity to tell him about the activities and mechanisms of each area. The more Hart heard, the more impressed he became, evaluating Johnny as a gentle, thoughtful person. He was especially respected by the villagers and had high loyalty to Hart. Hart had silently added him to the list of ideal servants, while Johnny continued talking non-stop. His incessant talking made Hart uncomfortable, thinking this guy was terribly talkative. Having to listen to him speak every day would truly exceed Hart's tolerance. As Johnny was about to say something more, Hart interrupted, using the excuse that he was busy, and quickly left the village. Hart sat by a stream, closing his eyes and sighing about how exhausting it was. He had thought he could live leisurely alone here. The peaceful space around him was shattered by the earth-shaking footsteps of a golem. He still remembered it as the giant golem that the group of summoners had called forth along with those zombies. The golem sat down beside him and offered Hart a flower. Despite its large size, this wasn't a problem, so he gave it a position where it could become a close servant. Hart had barely asked it a few questions when the golem's entire head emitted pink smoke, its voice softly saying it liked its master very much. Hart fled in fear from the forest, dejectedly wondering why finding a servant was so difficult. He needed to go home and rest for now, but didn't expect Flay to be waiting for him as soon as he opened the door. Seeing him enter, she sternly asked what he had meant earlier about a servant. For a moment, he had considered choosing Flay, but remembering his father's warning, he decided to ignore her for now. During her free time, Flay had taken Char to visit the magical beast village. The little girl conversed very seriously with Johnny. Char came up with an official name for this magical beast village, Pandemonium, the Garden of Monsters, in contrast to the harmonious scene in the monster village. Next to Baron Gold's territory, a considerable number of ice dragon hunters were gathering. They had cornered a young dragon, gleefully saying that if they caught it, they would certainly earn a lot of money. The ice dragon, taking advantage of heavy snowfall blocking visibility, dragged its wounded body away to find a new shelter. Gold, hearing of this, assigned Hart the task of assessing the situation, fearing it would invade their territory again. The dragon had been severely wounded by the Empire. If it went berserk, it could harm ordinary citizens. Flay, upon hearing this, directly refused to take on this mission because she didn't have a good impression of dragons. Dragons were an intelligent, powerful species, but when the demon lord was in danger, they had merely hidden in mountain caves without helping. Char, who had overheard the conversation, later asked Flay if she didn't intend to save that little dragon. Char was sad, saying if the friend was injured and alone, it would certainly be very lonely. As in previous instances, Char's wish was also Hart's wish, so Flay had no way to refuse. They immediately set out to find the little dragon. Standing on a high mountain, Hart used barriers to search for images below, and in a short time, he found the position of the world dragon, looking very weak. Flay called Hart's attention to another screen. The Imperial people were approaching, and they needed to hurry. Transforming into the appearance of justice warriors, the two successfully rescued the little dragon from the Imperial people. Hart could hear the voice and echoes of the little dragon in his head, a feeling similar to when he communicated with Flay. The little dragon curiously looked at Flay, asking if she was a magical beast, and why a magical beast would serve humans. Flay thought that since it had asked, she would clearly explain her fated encounter with Hart and his immensely great power. After an hour of storytelling, the little dragon expressed understanding, so it was a reincarnated little demon lord. Truly surprising. The little dragon apologized for not participating in the demon lord's war, explaining that she didn't like fighting. Hart, standing beside them, understood. Magical beasts were also divided into many types. He curiously asked what it had done to survive until now. The little dragon replied that to avoid being discovered, she had lived quietly in a mountain cave for about 300 years. At first, she had spent her days deep inside cave hollows. But then one day, an adventurer came to stay overnight and dropped a book. The little dragon curiously picked it up and read it countless times. She wanted to read more books, so she flew towards the town, transformed into human form, landed in the village, and took books to bring back. The little dragon repeated such actions many times and acquired much knowledge, until the day she was discovered by adventurers. During the pursuit, all her books were burned. Flay, hearing this, sobbed for the pitiful girl who was hunted by humans. She decided to recognize the little dragon as a fellow creature and let her join Pandemonium. Hart, hearing the unfamiliar name, asked where it was. Flay replied it was his village, named by Char. Hart didn't care much about this. Anyway, today he would take in this little dragon. The little dragon had no objection. After all, she had read many books to know that this was what affection was. Moreover, she had always wanted to connect with someone like this. After saying this, the little dragon transformed her body into human form, wishing for Hart to give her a name like humans have. He whispered, calling her Ice Dragon, so let's just call her Lisa. Hoping for her help in the coming days, Flay interjected in the conversation between the two, looking straight at Lisa and declaring that she was the first to serve Hart, while the little girl was only the second. With everything decided, Flay told the girl to return together. Although in human form, Hart could still use his wings to fly up. Hart used magic to fly beside the girl. Flay, lacking this skill, ran on the ground, shouting loudly that she couldn't be outdone. When Lisa first set foot in the Baron's family, she was greatly loved by Char and Natalia. Even Gold didn't expect the Ice Dragon to be such a lovely little girl. As far as he was concerned, as long as she followed the castle's rules, he had no problem with the family having another member. Flay took on the task of teaching Lisa normal human activities. While sweeping leaves in the yard, she told the little girl that if she had a casual attitude, she wouldn't be able to handle the work here. Flay twirled the broom in her hand, wanting to teach the girl how to hold it. But after just 2 spins, the broom broke in half. While Flay was showing off, Lisa had already cleaned the outdoor garden neatly. The next task was washing dishes. Ironically, Flay, who was the instructor, kept breaking them consecutively, while Lisa carefully wiped each one clean. When Flay tried to show off her cooking skills, she turned the kitchen black with smoke, while Lisa calmly prepared a colorful table of food that delighted the whole family. The little girl also attentively stood beside Char, serving her, wiping clean every bit of food stuck on her master's mouth. Natalia praised Lisa for doing everything so smoothly. The maids in the house reported that the little girl learned very quickly. She seriously asked if the girl was good at anything else. Lisa thought for a moment, then replied that because she liked reading books, she had knowledge about basic types of magic. Natalia happily suggested that Lisa could follow as Char's maid. From the start of her job, Lisa performed very well in her role as Char's close attendant, caring for her, teaching her magic, and reading books with her. Hart, passing by the training ground, heard his sister calling and turned back. After a few days of training, she could use magic to create a large fireball. Lisa, while teaching magic to her master, took advantage of the water created from magic to do laundry. Hart assessed that the girl was both teaching magic to his sister and completing household chores. Lisa was truly a good child, serious, able to learn, and highly adaptable. Hart suddenly had a thought. Could Lisa be the servant he had been looking for? Looking up at the 2 girls on the training ground again, Hart fell into a dilemma. How could he separate the 2 who had just become friends? Hart encouraged himself that there must be a solution. He whispered, "Wasn't there that trick, using the magic door?" Lisa could step through the door to the capital as his servant, then immediately return to the castle, which would be fine for both siblings. Hart thought that the search for a servant was solved. The next step would focus on the mission of getting expelled. During a break, Hart pretended to casually announce to the 2 girls that next week he would be going to school in the royal capital. Hearing this announcement, Char was extremely excited. Thinking about the bad people who also had magic, she asked Lisa to cancel all plans for the day to summon the knights for a round table conference. Char announced that the round table conference was a secret meeting. Besides Lisa and Flay, there were also Golem and Johnny. Flay, hearing that Hart was preparing to enter the royal school, angrily slammed the table, asking why he hadn't told her about this earlier. Char apologized, saying she had only just learned about it too. The little girl emphasized that because he was her brother, his choice of timing and audience surely had its meaning. She had heard her brother say that school was an extremely dangerous place, so she wouldn't let her big brother be afraid. According to what Char understood about her brother, Hart had certainly already placed a magic door in the royal capital. Therefore, she decided she would go with Lisa and Flay to the capital for a trip to gather information. Johnny and Gigan had the task of preparing for the day they would arrive and making pandemonium develop further. Though Lisa sat at the same table with them, she still had enough sense to know this matter needed to be reported to Hart. Hart thanked the little girl. Without being informed, who knows what would have happened. Lisa seriously asked if he was really confronting some mysterious organization. Hart knew she was a serious thinker, so he chose his words carefully to avoid hurting her. He admitted that he was acting secretly behind the scenes. He directly stated his request for Lisa to come with him to the royal capital as his close servant. Hart told her that details would be provided later, but only she could know and do this. It was an important mission. Lisa, seeing Hart's serious demeanor, agreed to help him. The cooperation between the 2 was completely secret. No one in the house knew. On the other side, Flay was still diligently trying to become a real servant with Char's help. The first task, changing into servant attire, failed because Flay couldn't fit into the clothes. For the second task, Char asked if she knew how to fly. Flay replied that it wasn't exactly impossible to fly. She then demonstrated by jumping up and down and flying into the nearby forest. When she returned, she was covered in tree branches and dirt. Char, not understanding, looked at Flay with sparkling eyes, praising her for being so skilled. Natalia, coming out from the house, asked what the 2 were doing. When she learned that the little girl wanted to learn flying magic, she was alarmed and disagreed, saying her daughter wasn't old enough for such strenuous activities. Flay, left with no other option, ran to find Hart for help. He had already seen everything on the monitoring screen. As soon as she opened the door, he handed her a mini airplane just big enough for one person to fly. Once again, seeing his sister happily sitting on the airplane, Hart whispered that the first mission was successful. The next step was to learn about Lisa's daily routine. He directly asked the little girl what she did in a day when she isolated herself. Lisa listed. First, waking up at noon to read the book left unfinished from the previous day, falling asleep in the afternoon, waking up again in the evening to read, then falling asleep again. Hart whispered that it was truly an ideal life. He then asked about her eating habits. Lisa calculated about once a week. Hart was amazed, saying she was even on a diet, truly a senior in the field of self-isolation. On a leisurely day, Lisa sought out Hart, asking him to explain the mechanism of the magic door. He used his hands to describe that it was simply placing 2 doors in 2 places and connecting them. The little girl, with her hand on her chin, disagreed, saying his answer didn't explain anything. Lisa expressed her thoughts that teleportation magic was originally a high-level magic that one person alone couldn't perform. Hart found an excuse, explaining that because he didn't feel much magic consumption. Perhaps it was something different. Lisa was alarmed, asking if it wasn't magic from this world. Hart sighed, thinking perhaps the little girl had understood. A few days later, Hart designed a device to measure magic power, asking everyone to come for a test. The first was Flay, displaying 40 out of 77. Lisa's was 36 out of 71. Char, seeing these scores, admiringly praised the two incessantly. Hart thought that magical creatures naturally had high magic levels. When it was Char's turn, he was surprised. The little girl's score was also extremely high, at 61. He recalled that, if not mistaken, the Queen's published magic level was only 44. Flay spoke up, praising the little girl, saying that wasn't bad. Hart seriously asked his sister if she continued training. Would she immediately reach the maximum value? Char replied that wasn't possible. Before she had awareness, she had created a fireball, so her mother had performed a sealing spell. Hart, dumbfounded, asked if it was true. Then there was a genius here. Char was also curious, asking what about her big brother's level. Without waiting for him to answer, Flay replied that of course it exceeded 100. Hart only gave the words secret. Hart's enrollment day finally arrived, and the whole family came to see him off. Lisa, whom he brought along, had her ears and tail hidden. Without these things, the little girl looked somewhat anxious. Flay, realizing she wasn't the one going, collapsed painfully on the ground. Char, standing beside her brother, encouraged him that evil would be defeated, and for her big brother to do his best. Marion, excited, took something from the Baron and entered her brother's room to show him. Laius guessed that the letter was a notification that Hart was on his way to the royal capital. He told his sister that such matters didn't need to be announced bit by bit. Marion disagreed, saying it was because her brother wanted to recommend Hart that she was trying so hard. She wanted to know why her brother wanted to go to such lengths. Laius replied that he just wanted to know Hart's strength. After that time, he had tried his best to hone his magic and swordsmanship. But each time, he had the feeling that Hart had left him far behind. Thus, the only way was to study at the same school, so he could know if he had gotten closer to Hart's level. Laius teased his sister that she was more infatuated with Hart than he was, sitting in their father's room for a long time waiting for the recommendation letter. He said he had no opinion on romance or anything like that. But was it really so? He sighed, seriously asking his sister if the situation was tense. Laius had heard that strange religious groups were rampant in the academy. Marion asked her brother if he already knew about that. They were the Lucifer religion. She had heard it was a religion disguised as a sect of the Mija state religion. Their ideology was extreme, and they were worshipping demons. Not only limited to the academy, it was said that this force was expanding throughout the country. Moreover, the number of nobles joining was increasing, and they were receiving an extremely large source of investment. Laius seriously asked his sister about the rumor that the money came from their mother. He really didn't know what their mother was planning. If he had to admit it, Laius truly felt afraid of her. She was becoming increasingly extreme. Currently, news of the king and queen's discord was spreading throughout the country. Though he dared not think it, there was a high possibility that their mother wanted to crush their father. Laius asked his sister what they should do. She replied that although it was just a casual thought, perhaps Hart could change the situation. At this point, Laius remembered the story about the Dark Knight in Baron Gold's territory, an ally of justice who could defeat even dragons. Laius stood up abruptly, saying that if they asked that person for help, wouldn't the problem be solved more easily than imagined? Gislot entered, interrupting their conversation, saying her children were conversing very eagerly. Marion greeted her, saying it had been a long time since they met. She praised her, saying each time they met, she became more beautiful, like the previous queen. Suddenly, she grabbed the princess's neck, asking if she had just looked at her collar. She shouted loudly, asking if it looked funny, pitiful, or if she was mocking her. Seeing his sister about to be killed, Laius shouted, begging his mother to stop. Gislot released her hand, laughing loudly, saying she was just joking. She reminded Marion that thoughtless eyes would make her lose her lady's dignity. She then turned to ask Laius about the news that Baron Gold's son would be studying at the same school as her son. Gislot emphasized that because he had to leave the countryside, the boy would surely be very lonely, so her son should be friendly with the lad. She whispered into the prince's ear, requesting him to collect information about the Dark Knight from Gold's son. Watching her leave, Laius stood frozen, wondering if he had inadvertently drawn Hart into something beyond imagination. On Hart's side, he had just stepped out of the door in the forest near the royal capital, as only this place could hide the door. Standing on a high area, Hart looked towards the royal capital. With this distance, flying would be very quick, but they had no other way than to walk. Lisa, hearing a sound, pointed in another direction, calling Hart to look. An evil bison was chasing a group of people traveling by horse-drawn carriage. Lisa thought it was because it was hungry, so it was chasing and attacking humans. Hart wanted to ignore it, but if Char found out about this, it would be a big issue. Currently, he wasn't in a hurry, so he had to step in to help. Hart transformed into the Dark Knight, crashed into the horse-drawn carriage to stop it, helping the people on the carriage run down. At that moment, a girl from the carriage told everyone to run away. She would hold the evil bison back. Hart thought she was a strong person, so he didn't intervene, just standing aside to watch. Unexpectedly, just one suction from the evil bison sent her flying. If it stomped on her one more time, she would die. Hart caught the evil bison just in time before it harmed her. He also took the opportunity to heal the girl. A young boy with admiring eyes approached to thank him. The Dark Knight bowed his head, telling the child there was no need to thank him, as he acted for justice. Hart also took the opportunity to repair the horse-drawn carriage for the group. The girl standing beside him said that as a person without much money like her, who was given a ride, she was very grateful. Ordinarily, she would have to thank him with money or items, but Hart understood what the girl wanted to say, so he waved his hand, telling her not to worry. Justice worked without requiring repayment. After the group left, he and Lisa fed the evil bison until it was full so it wouldn't attack citizens anymore, then continued into the city. On the way, Hart concernedly asked the little girl why she kept frowning. Lisa replied that the girl from earlier gave her a very strange feeling. If she had gotten closer, perhaps she would have known. Hart didn't answer the little girl because he didn't plan to stay in this place long. The chance of meeting that person again was zero. The process of registration lining up, filling in enrollment information, and receiving a room completely drained the energy of an old person like Hart. As soon as he entered his room, Hart set up the magic door to return. Today's activities were more than enough. As soon as Char saw him step out, she eagerly asked her brother how things were in the royal capital. He tiredly stretched out on the couch, lying down, asking Flay to prepare food. Char whispered to Flay, and both of them used the excuse that they would go outside to buy food for him, then stepped through the door to go to the royal capital. Hart, not feeling at ease letting the two go alone, also followed. He didn't think the neighborhood around the palace would be so bustling. After eating, Char brought out a map of the area, placing it on the table for everyone to see. To understand the geography of the royal capital, the little girl began assigning Flay to go south, Lisa to go west, while she and her brother would investigate eastward. Hart looked at everyone in confusion, asking if they didn't want to come here to play. Char replied that of course they did, but they still needed to understand the geography in case it was necessary. The little girl emphasized that the purpose was only to understand the geography, so she hoped everyone wouldn't be too noisy or stand out. Hearing Flay asking them to trust her, in Hart's mind, he immediately thought, trust and die, but since he was there, he would go with Char. They went through many famous places in the royal capital. On the way, Char even selected a pretty pair of earrings. Hart indulged his sister. Whatever she wanted, he bought. Char happily ran ahead, while he followed behind, reminding his sister to be careful not to bump into others. Just as Hart finished speaking, the little girl ran into someone crossing the road. Running to the spot, he realized it was the girl he had helped earlier. The girl looked at Hart, then asked if they had met before. Since the previous meeting was in his Dark Knight state, Hart replied that this was the first time they had met. The girl pondered, saying that indeed, she had no memory of Hart's face, but she did have a memory of the enormous magical power she sensed from him. She tilted her head, telling him that his magic was only 2. Hart pretended to be annoyed, saying that even if he had the enormous magical power she mentioned, he would only feel mocked. Such a matter of lost honor, even if lying, could not be spoken of. The girl thought that because she had just gone through a long journey, she felt tired and confused. She sincerely apologized for making Hart uncomfortable. Hart reminded the girl that more importantly, wasn't she in a hurry. The girl remembered what she needed to do, apologized to the siblings once more, then hurriedly ran off. Seeing his sister still gazing after the girl, he asked if something was wrong with her. Char didn't understand, but she sensed there was something very strange about that person, a feeling that she wasn't an ordinary person. Hearing his sister's words made Hart remember that Lisa had said something similar. He wondered if that person had high abilities like magical creatures, or if Char could sense something else. In any case, he didn't want to get involved in these troubles. Starting tomorrow, he would begin school and leisurely lock himself in his room. Hart returned to his room, where his duplicate informed him that a faculty member had burst in, demanding a pre-enrollment assessment. Hart refused to go, saying he had already endured staying in this room for too long. Hart thought this could be a good opportunity. He would perform so poorly that the teachers would expel him from school. He excitedly left, thinking if this worked, he wouldn't need to stay here anymore, resolving things quickly. Hart arrived at the door and was led into the classroom by Polkos to take the assessment test. He was overwhelmed by the royal capital's lavishness. Just one classroom was large enough to hold over 100 people. Hart was moved, looking around, thinking that if he passed, next spring he would study in this classroom. He didn't let what was before his eyes deceive him. He was determined to fail this assessment test. Reading the first question, he truly didn't understand anything, so he just wrote, "Don't know." For barrier magic, Hart only answered at a certain level. He was satisfied with the test he had just completed, having answered perfunctorily, surely not earning any points. Finally, there was ancient magic. Hart remembered reading a book with his sister by an author with an excessively long name, which was very interesting. While thinking, Hart inadvertently wrote out everything, only realizing with alarm when he had finished. Gold announced that everyone would move to another room for magical assessment. Hart didn't want to go, asking why he should when his magic was only level 2. But the teacher insisted on taking him, saying these were orders. The teacher in the magic room was a little girl. When she saw Hart, she praised him for matching her taste perfectly. The teacher introduced herself as Terrietta, researching ancient magic here. She laughed loudly, asking Hart if he was thinking, "This kid is a teacher?" She then changed her tone, shouting that he was truly disrespectful. Terrietta said that even if he was recommended by the kingdom, if he damaged her mood, the outcome would still be returning home. Hearing Hart excitedly ask, "Really?" her concern shifted to the young teacher. The interested attitude Hart had just shown wasn't fear like others had, but full of expectation. Looking at the small teacher in front of him who was shouting, Hart felt a headache, wondering how long this absurd situation would continue. Teacher Polkos reminded the doctor to get to the main point, handing over the test Hart had just completed. Seeing Terrietta's expression change, Hart was satisfied, thinking she was indeed angry with his random answers. He then proceeded to measure his magic on the sphere, not worrying much since it would only show 2 anyway. The light from Hart's magic caused the sphere to shatter. He cursed, saying it was truly fake. Hart anticipated a scolding from Terrietta and expulsion from school. Terrietta shouted loudly, asking Teacher Polkos if he had seen anything. The sphere had broken. This was proof that his magic was so great that the sphere couldn't measure it. The teacher uncomfortably replied that he had heard rumors Hart's magic was only 2. The doctor laughed loudly, saying she believed there were exceptions to everything. Suddenly, she shouted that the sphere was a magic measuring tool, but she didn't fully understand how it worked. As a mage, one should pursue that understanding before discussing his power. Terrietta looked at Hart's test with sparkling eyes, saying indeed, he hadn't reached the level of court mages. Boldly answering "don't know" in the test was very spirited, and his expression on barrier magic was exceptionally outstanding. Terrietta became more excited when she reached the ancient magic section, which quoted directly from her own work. Hart, hearing this, felt like he had dug his own grave. It turned out the author of that long-winded book was her. Terrietta vehemently declared she would take this interesting young man rather than hand him over to other teachers. Hart watched them arguing, feeling something wasn't quite right. He was being pulled into their amusement. He dejectedly went back to tell Hart C everything. All future matters would depend on him. Understanding Hart C's concern about going to school, his sister brought out the gun given by her brother and handed it to him. The little girl encouraged him to try his best to complete the mission extraordinarily. Hart C was sad, saying he didn't want to go to school. After all, he was just a copy without magic, so how could he deal with the bad people at school? In the end, as a copy, how could he refuse the task Hart had entrusted to him? So, enduring sitting in class for a long day, as soon as the bell rang, Hart C quickly wanted to escape back to the dormitory. On the way back, he encountered a group of people. His intuition told Hart C to stay away from them, as getting involved would lead to nothing good. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to make himself invisible, not expecting that while walking with his head down, he would bump into the girl from before. Both looked at each other in surprise. Schnelder, noticing them, asked why they didn't bow. The girl replied that she had been disrespectful, but the school rules didn't specify such things. Schnelder himself didn't want to touch them. He just wanted to maintain his authority in front of everyone. The girl had apologized, saying she was new on the first day and didn't know, with her eyes turning to Hart C, waiting for him to make up an excuse so they could be released. No one present expected Hart C to suddenly clutch his stomach and shout that he needed to use the toilet, making Schnelder flush with anger. He shouted, "Bastard, how dare you insult me with such vile words?" He used magic, determined to teach Hart C about etiquette. Hart C didn't think much, only knowing that if he didn't run, the one losing his life would be him. Schnelder, standing at a distance, aimed at Hart C and attacked. He was immediately hit flat on the ground, with a large piece of fabric torn from the back of his clothes. Just as they were about to leave, Hart C once again didn't understand the situation, stood up, dusted himself off, and mumbled. Fortunately, the barrier release worked effectively. Hart C turned to see the unpleasant expression of the vice president. Only then did he think that at this point, he needed to show pain. His exaggerated act only made Schnelder more irritated. Schnelder again intended to use magic to attack. Hart C, frightened, pulled out the gun and fired, taking the opportunity to run quickly back to the dormitory. Hart, receiving the news, shouted loudly, asking why it had to be so troublesome. While checking the barriers around, Hart saw the image of the girl on her way to the head student's house. The scene shifted to Schnelder's house, where he, being violent, angrily splashed water on the person treating his wounds. Naturally, he wasn't easily accepting the girl's apology. He made a demand that Hart couldn't sit still for. He appeared again in his Dark Knight form. After helping the girl return to the dormitory, he created a separate space to teach Schnelder a lesson. He attached a magical device to his shoulder, warning that if he tried to remove it or use magic, it would tighten on his shoulder and suck his blood. The Dark Knight set a condition: if he sincerely reflected on his actions, he would consider releasing it. The next morning, when he arrived at school, rumors that Baron Gold's son had defeated Schnelder spread everywhere. Wherever Hart went, he was followed by the admiring eyes of others. He couldn't stand this feeling and just wanted to find a way to escape. Unexpectedly, he bumped into Terrietta, who asked if he wanted to come to the laboratory. Terrietta taught Hart about the Academy's curriculum. First was the night course, where students learned to apply magic in training. The course aimed to create soldiers and knights, the core force of the country in the future. The remaining scholar course was where they taught the most effective use of magic or studied and developed magic at the Research Institute. Terrietta saw that Hart was interested in ancient magic, so coming to her place was a right decision. She presented a paper, enticing Hart to sign and confirm if he wanted to study. Laius, seeing Hart from afar, rushed over, shouting that he had found him. The prince greeted him with a direct punch to the face. Hart easily dodged it and countered. Hart didn't know who had suddenly attacked him until he heard Marion angrily calling Laius's name. She scolded her brother, asking if anyone sends greetings in such an impolite manner. Laius complained. "Hart, you've gotten stronger again, haven't you?" Returning to the main topic, Marion asked Hart if he had entered this institute yet. If not, he could join the Research Institute with her. Laius interrupted his sister, saying she was too selfish, and Hart would join his course. Terriette shouted loudly for the two siblings to be quiet, saying Hart would join her. Laius recognized her as the doctor with the excessively long name. He whispered into Hart's ear, letting him know that she seemed to be researching ancient things and hadn't produced results for ages. Especially, she often had conflicts with other teachers. Terriette objected, saying it wasn't that she had no achievements, but that fools couldn't see them. Thus, the three argued endlessly with no sign of stopping. Just when the girl Hart had rescued earlier passed by, curiously looking to see what was happening, Hart thought he could use her to leave. He said goodbye to the three, promising to see them later, and quickly slipped away. Hart ran far from the building before stopping to catch his breath, apologizing for dragging her into this. The girl didn't care about this, just staring intently at Hart, then asking if he and the person yesterday were the same person. She could sense that the person in front of her and the person who ran away yesterday were two completely different people. More precisely, yesterday's Hart gave her no sense of magic, but today he exuded a great pressure that overshadowed others. Hart currently couldn't answer her question clearly, so he hoped she would consider them as one person. Hart looked at the girl for a moment, then asked if that was the end of the matter. Insphilia hesitated for a moment, then bowed before Hart, saying first, she wanted to apologize for dragging him into trouble. Second, she wanted to thank him for helping her escape from Schnelder's group. And finally, Insphilia made a request, hoping Hart could become her friend. She would be very happy if he were the first to accept her request. Hart was surprised by the girl's proposal. He asked if she had never had friends before. Insphilia asked Hart for some time to tell her story. She told Hart that since birth, she had been abandoned 4 times because she could speak, and finally was taken in by a monastery. Although she was accepted into the monastery, life wasn't easy. The priest she loved most died when she was 5. It was a closed environment with no contact with people around, so she didn't know how humans lived. Hart showed understanding, saying that Insphilia wanted to learn how to make friends. If that was the purpose, then she had chosen the wrong person, because he didn't make friends outside, so he wasn't familiar with social norms either. Insphilia saw this as a good thing. They could try to learn together. She remarked that they had a lot in common. Hart thought he would use this person to avoid a lot of hassle in school. Remembering the class assignment, Hart asked Insphilia if she had chosen a research class yet. Hearing it was ancient magic, Hart was tired of encountering that ant everywhere. With no other choice, he chose Terrietta to be in the same class with her for convenience. Insphilia happily asked if he still wanted to be friends after hearing her story. Insphilia was overjoyed, wanting to thank Hart. Char was bored because her brother's attendance at school increased her free time, not knowing what to do. Just then, she sensed that Hart had good news and quickly said goodbye to Flay to find her brother. At home, Flay and Lisa remained. After a while of chatting, the latter mentioned magical creatures. Flay told Lisa that her previous job was to stay beside the Demon Lord, uniting the magical creatures. She had an extremely close relationship with the Demon Lord, who could be considered her best friend. Flay's eyes lit up with admiration when mentioning her old master. The Demon Lord was someone who always thought of magical creatures and monsters first, a kind person. It was precisely because of this kindness that the Demon Lord often had conflicts with other Demon Lords about how to treat humans. That's why Flay always had to step in to resolve those conflicts. The Demon Lord had an extremely noble ideal: to create a paradise where humans and monsters could live together. Flay now thought that maybe from the beginning, he hadn't wanted to fight with Princess Lightning and intentionally let himself lose. There was one thing that greatly surprised Flay. When attacked by Princess Lightning, he let all the magical creatures escape, sacrificing himself for his ideals. Flay was certain he had planned to reincarnate as a human beforehand. Lisa asked if that meant he intended to reincarnate as a human and change human perception from the root. Flay couldn't confirm if the Demon Lord had thought to that extent, but his innocent way of thinking was what she liked. She remembered Hart saying that memories from before reincarnation all disappeared. Flay guessed that doing so was to discard the sweet, unable to be cruel part of himself. Flay continued, saying the Demon Lord often simplified their species, so when Hart named her, she was very surprised. She also hadn't hesitated to reveal his name when he was still the Demon Lord. Lisa replied, "That's right, not everyone can know the Demon Lord's name." Flay told her not to reveal it to anyone. The Demon Lord's name was Insphilia. On Hart's side, he had just made friends with a girl. When he heard the girl's name was Insphilia, he just felt it was too long and shortened it to Iris. He didn't recall that this name had been mentioned by Flay before. Iris had no opinion about this short name. She asked Hart if he had chosen classes yet. If not, they could do it together. She thought doing it together would be more effective. Hart enthusiastically led Iris back to his room to do the assignments together. It was only at the door that he remembered she was a girl. Now it would be too awkward to send her away. The only option was to finish quickly and then return home. Char was sitting in the room waiting for her brother. Seeing Hart bring back a beautiful girl, the little girl laughed loudly. Char praised him, saying indeed, her brother had already made a beautiful friend. She then sadly mumbled that, of course, he would find 5 or 10 girlfriends. Hart had no opinion on his sister's words. He sat down at the table and began selecting a class. Concentrating for not long, he became bored and asked his sister to choose for him. Char happily obliged, then truly seriously prepared a paper and handed it over. Having returned with free time, Char talked non-stop with Iris. The little girl told the older girl that her brother had surpassed the level of having to learn from someone else. Her big brother's existence was transcendent. Iris seriously asked Hart if he was so extraordinary. Hart inwardly exclaimed, "Oh no, she really believes it." If he didn't send Char away, things would get worse. The little girl read her brother's eyes, stood up, and said goodbye to the two. Hart's subsequent studies were all arranged with subjects chosen by Char. Looking at the difficult subjects his sister had chosen, Hart thought this was good. Because for difficult subjects, the teacher's expectations would also be extremely high. He would more easily be judged as failing. On class assignment day, Lisa once again came into contact with Iris. The little girl cautiously asked Hart if she was really human. Even at close distance, she still couldn't clearly determine if Iris was a magical creature or human. Judging by appearances, Hart didn't think she was a magical creature, and she didn't seem to have any harmful motives, so there was no need to worry. Hart was assigned to Class C, the middle class among 5, with average performance overall. Before teaching, the teacher explained to everyone that they could be downgraded or upgraded based on tests. The teacher began distributing the first assessment test to the class. Hart thought to himself that the opportunity had come quickly. For this test, he would freely underperform and pretend to fall behind, then bid farewell to the classroom today. Hart looked at the entire test. It was terribly easy. Char had done it half a year ago. He didn't know what the homeroom teacher was thinking, giving them a child's test. Anyway, if this time he did terribly wrong, it would be seen as deliberate. So he would intentionally make mistakes at the lowest boundary and aim for a score of 6 points through careless errors. All of Hart's calculations collapsed when the homeroom teacher graded the papers and announced that the class average was only 2. Looking at Hart's test, the teacher's eyes lit up. Though he had many careless errors, he still scored 6 points. Hart looked at everyone around him applauding, not understanding what had happened. Could it be that only his test was easy? After thinking for a moment, he realized it wasn't due to everyone's low ability or the test's simplicity, but because his sister was a genius. Everything was too late. The homeroom teacher informed Hart that he would recommend him for Class A. When Hart set foot in Class A, he was flanked on both sides by Iris and Laius, who began arguing over the position next to him. Hart helplessly let them do as they pleased. The teacher entered the classroom, annoyed by the noise, and slammed her roster on the desk as a reminder. She introduced herself as Belgam, teaching calculation theory, her eyes shooting toward the three of them. She shouted that the 3 first-year students who had chosen advanced courses and were sitting in the front row talking were truly brave. Belgam warned them to prepare mentally. When they couldn't answer questions, they would be kicked out of the class. She directly called out Hart and Iris, who belonged to the research room of that bespectacled little girl, saying she would teach them with dedication. Belgam began her lecture. Today's topic was primary attributes and secondary attributes. Iris was called up to place her hand on a sphere. She looked into the sphere and exclaimed that having all attributes was indeed a magnificent sight. Belgam made an offer that she could join her research class, and she would hone her thoroughly. After hearing her presentation, Iris flatly refused. Belgam returned to her lecture, using Iris's attributes as an example to teach the class about different types of attributes. However, the crystal sphere couldn't clearly express every detail and to what extent. Research to quantify this was being conducted, but it was extremely difficult. Hart silently wondered if it was really that difficult. He only needed to look at the requirements, and all the indicators within Iris were displayed in detail. On the podium, Belgam began explaining why it was difficult to approach. Because depending on the case, the values would be chaotic. If one had already used magic to enhance power on the secondary attribute of fire, then the ratio would increase higher than other fire magic. She looked at Laius, asking him why that was and to answer quickly. Laius thought, then replied that it must be the level of proficiency. He explained further that because enhancement had been used many times, it had become proficient. Belgam praised his approach as not bad, but it was being rejected by research. Hart whispered, "It's hidden attributes." Belgam, standing nearby, heard this and excitedly slammed the table, asking Hart what he had just said and to repeat it. Hart explained that he thought there were hidden attributes attached to attributes. For example, if fire had a secondary attribute of enhancement, then the effect of self-enhancement type magic would increase significantly. Belgam patted Hart's shoulder and shouted loudly, asking how he knew that, as it was the latest research by Weisowl. Weisowl was a figure who regularly sent dissertations to the Research Institute in an irregular manner, an anonymous person. This person's research dissertations were ahead of their time and had been proposed not to be displayed. Belgam was excited because everything was done in secret. Even the royal family hadn't received the report. She loudly stated that she didn't expect Hart to be such a rare talent. Once again, she asked him how he felt and if he wanted to abandon ancient magic to come to her place. Hart refused. Iris reminded the teacher that recruiting during class was a matter beyond etiquette. Both outstanding students chose to follow Terrietta, which delighted her immensely. Finally, her passion had been transmitted. Thanks to the 2 students who had just joined, the research room could continue to exist until they graduated. Terrietta happily ran off to prepare a celebration party, instructing Hart and Iris to relax and wait there before she left. Hart C sat beside Iris, inwardly cursing why it had to be him. Today should have been the original version, but because Hart had encountered too many tiring events in the morning, he didn't want to go anymore. Anyway, since the confirmation had already been signed, Hart C took the opportunity when no one was paying attention to slip away, carelessly kicking someone lying on the floor. Terrietta, passing by just then, explained that because Schnelder had been affected by a strange type of magic, he had come to ask her to look into it. She maintained an eager expression, looking at the person lying motionless, saying what a good opportunity it was to have someone to use for ancient magic research. Terrietta called Iris to come and look. She performed some operations on Schnelder, then asked her what type of magic she thought it was. Iris observed, then pondered if it could be attributeless magic. Terrietta, hearing the result, praised her as indeed the top of the examination. She told the 2 that, in summary, this was created from attributeless barrier magic. Terrietta posed the next question to her remaining student, Hart. What was the biggest difference between modern magic and ancient magic? He sighed, then answered randomly, perhaps it was the antiquity. Terrietta suppressed her irritation, throwing the question to Iris. The 2 discussed for a long time before calling the unconscious person to wake up. She informed him that the research room couldn't solve this type of magic. Only the person who cast the spell could. Terrietta told him there was no other way but to quickly reveal the identity of that person. Schnelder gritted his teeth, replying that he also didn't know, only that it was someone dressed in black with a strange voice. Upon hearing this, she laughed loudly, asking if being defeated by someone of unknown identity wasn't shameful. Terrietta had early on read his thoughts. He was just afraid of putting himself in danger by speaking. No matter, even if he didn't say, she could already guess who that person was. Terrietta focused on her 2 students, talking about the ally of justice in Baron Gold's territory who had characteristics similar to what Schnelder had described. She raised the suspicion that this person always operated within the territory until Hart came to the imperial capital. Teriata excitedly asked Hart what he had been hiding from her, telling him to speak up if he had some other magic. The consecutive interrogative questions made Hart C want to cry, inwardly calling loudly for the original Hart to come solve this. The Dark Knight suddenly appeared at the window frame. Schnelder, just seeing him, became angry, asking if he had been constantly monitoring them to appear at such a precise moment. The Dark Knight just told him to quickly think about the conditions he had set and cancel tomorrow's duel. As he was about to leave, he was restrained by Teriata's magic. She had many questions, and if he didn't answer, he couldn't leave. As soon as she finished speaking, Hart exploded everything entangling him. He took the opportunity to teach Teriata a lesson: never restrain others arbitrarily. Teriata, controlled by magic and unable to move, had to beg Hart for forgiveness, promising never to do it arbitrarily again. The welcome party had 4 attendees. Teriata chatted animatedly with Iris. Hart C sat silently watching the two of them. After a while, Teacher Polkos took the initiative to chat with Hart C. He told him that T had been his student. She had always been straightforward like this since childhood. Being very intelligent, learning 1 to understand 10, learning 10 to understand 100, she had achieved considerable success. And because there was nothing left to do at the mansion, she had enrolled in this academy. Therefore, he was also instructed to supervise her. In the end, all that he had taught her from the beginning was no longer needed. T was truly a genius. Not only could she research new magic, but she was also considered a sage, the leader of modern magic. The party ended with Iris rolling over and falling asleep. It was then that T turned her attention to Hart, asking if he knew why Iris had chosen ancient magic. T had encountered Iris during the exam, achieving an extremely high score. Her feeling was no different than a commoner trying to conquer a dream. However, unfortunately, Iris's magic value was still too low, and more sadly, her indicators might not increase further. But ancient magic was a correct choice because it could research clues to increase magic levels. T had never researched it. She would start from now on and felt very excited, even though the percentage of success was very small. On the other side, Schnelder was extremely angry. News of the withdrawal of tomorrow's duel would spread throughout the academy. He slammed his hand repeatedly on the table, whispering that he had gone as far as colluding with Lucifer to make his father the next king. Yet someone was blocking his path. He couldn't accept that at this rate, his plans would be shattered. Schnelder summoned a special assassination team, ordering that within tonight, they must assassinate Iris's group. The plan began to be implemented when all 4 people in the research institute were sound asleep. Outside, they were careful to create barriers for sound insulation and detection of intruders. Moreover, the attack team consisted of the most elite people. When they approached the research institute, they discovered that the institute was protected by an invisible, impenetrable wall. Suddenly, a door opened in the wall, and one by one, they were pulled inside. The remaining people began to be wary of the rumor that beside Hart, there was always an anonymous person, Siva, protecting him. They needed to be more careful. A moment later, countless more doors opened, and the Dark Knight attacked from all directions. The group fell into confusion. They had only heard of one person, but when they appeared, there were too many Dark Knights attacking from every direction. The leader of the assassination team discovered the truth. Behind it all, there was only one Dark Knight sitting high up controlling everything, and now only he could move. Hart complained that their master, just for a small matter, wanted to assassinate others truly unbearable. He captured the entire assassination team and brought them to Schnelder's house, asking if one clamp wasn't enough for him. Trembling, he asked if Hart would kill him. Like a madman, he searched for a syringe and injected himself. Hart, looking at the troublesome thing before him, complained that his senior had transformed into a monster using a mysterious syringe. He didn't know how to handle this situation, though he very much wanted to pretend he hadn't seen anything. Just then, the barrier connecting with Char opened. The little girl, sitting in front of the screen, called loudly for her brother. Having gone to bed early, but with a premonition that her brother was actively operating, she had woken up. Hart sighed, telling the little girl that just now, he was also fighting with a mysterious monster. The little girl curiously asked which monster friend it was. Hart briefly explained to her that it was a human transformed into a monster by an organization. Char worriedly asked if her brother had any way to save that person. Seeing Char's pained expression, he had no choice but to help this lucky guy. Hart flew in front, trying to reduce the damage capability on Schnelder, but was caught by him with 2 large hands. He was squeezed between the palms. He tried using magic restraints to force him to open his hands. With his hands unable to move, Schnelder chose to destroy his 2 arms to grow new ones. Hart understood that this was the type that could regenerate. He didn't know what should be done next. Char opened the connection again to let her brother know that the monster friend was a bit strange. Its body had shrunk a little. The little girl had also carefully observed that the monster's skin color had also faded. Hart deduced that when he continuously cut off the parts that had become large, the body would gradually return to its original form. Thanks to guidance from his sister, Schnelder was saved and returned to human form. Char praised her brother for being very skillful, saying she would have a beautiful dream tonight. After wishing his sister good night, he wanted to continue the earlier conversation with Schnelder. As soon as he heard Hart call his name, he frantically ran away. It seemed today they couldn't continue a serious conversation. Hart thought he would talk again another time, but had to collect the syringe that he had used. Today had been a tiring day. He needed to quickly clean up the villa and go to sleep. Hart opened the window and stood beside Hart, who was floating outside, asking how he felt. As for him, he had begun to enjoy these things. He and Hart had a special connection, so he could be sure that both felt the same. Hart didn't deny that everything in the outside world was much better, but somehow, he felt that being connected to others wasn't bad either. Hart looked at the people lying inside the institute, then told Hart to sleep there tonight as it was past the dormitory curfew. Hart sincerely praised Hart for doing very well. The group of servants, under Char's direction, had gone throughout the streets of the royal capital collecting information. Finally, they received results. The relationship between the king and queen was deteriorating, so the situation among other nobles had also become tense. All of Char's initial predictions were correct. She had a feeling that danger was approaching the royal capital. Johnny spoke up, saying no, the enemy had already begun to act. He asked Char if she had seen the reality of how the monarchists handled the vanguard troops. Johnny asked the little girl to recreate those images for them to see. Seeing the battle between Hart and Schnelder, one after another, Char, then Flay, then Johnny all looked with admiration, praising continuously. Lisa, sitting beside them, felt that everything was going off track but had no intention of reminding everyone. Later, Char began to explain that the person inside the screen was the vice president of the student council. According to Char's deduction, he was taking orders from the hidden student council. In summary, they had caught wind of Hart's power, so they had caused no small amount of trouble since her brother enrolled. And that had a direct connection with a huge evil organization that would shake the capital. Flay expressed that it didn't matter. No matter how strong the opponent, they couldn't defeat Hart. Char replied that despite that, this time they didn't know how far their hiding places extended, so that part would become a burden. Therefore, this was the moment for everyone to take action by infiltrating the academy, collecting information, and gradually exposing them. Char declared that they were people with the same ideology, gathering at this moment to support her brother's activities. Hart observed the group of kids' plan but didn't intend to coordinate. He would observe like this and ensure their safety because a peaceful, uneventful life of withdrawal was all he wanted.